Labour's shadow chancellor, Rachel Reeves, delivered the Mace lecture this week. Did she lay out a progressive programme of economic reform, or has her pragmatism taken her to a place where she is simply promising to be continuity Jeremy Hunt? MPs' salaries increased to £91,000 per year. Is that too much, not enough, or just about right? We'll be asking our political commentator, Goldilocks Hancock, what he thinks about that particular rise. And mixed news for Rishi Sunak in the polls this week. One had the Tories on just 18% of the vote, but others showed that if the Conservatives decided to ditch the Prime Minister, the government would be even more unpopular. Have Tory MPs decided? Better the devil you know. Welcome to this week's Politics Podcast in the Downtown Den.
Just it's all bigoted women.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Hello, Goldilocks, Jim. Lovely to see you.
Yes, very good. I shall respond to that.
Yeah, it's me, Frank McKenna, the Chief Executive and Group Chair of Downtown Business, with our political commentator, Jim Hancock, of course. And this week we'll be looking at those three things: Rachel Reeves' Mace lecture, the £91,000 increase in salary to members of Parliament, and the latest polls. So, James, let's start with the Mace lecture, a very prestigious thing for a shadow chancellor to be asked to do, because I was sort of looking at the people who delivered that lecture in the past. Nigel Lawson, famously, back in, I think it was 83, 84, when he was chancellor. And then Gordon Brown, interestingly, was invited to deliver that lecture when he was shadow chancellor, as was George Osborne. Interestingly, not Ed Balls. So Ed Balls never asked to deliver the Mace lecture. So what does it tell us that Rachel Reeves, before we get into the content of what she said, was actually just on that platform? That again indicates that many people now are thinking that it will be a Labour government.
Yes, I think obviously business is always pragmatic in politics and tries to detect which way things are going. And they, like most of the rest of us, some with more qualifications than others. You will have read my blog last week where I thought there was some slight indications of recovery. We'll talk about that for the government. But generally speaking, business, like most people, are factoring in a Labour government and therefore want to hear from Rachel Reeves because she's going to be, in all likely circumstances, the next Chancellor of the Exchequer. Not only that, she's calling the shots. You know, you sort of feel, I mean, I'm not suggesting there's any tension between her and Rishi and Sir Keir Starmer, but, you know, she certainly seems to be laying it down that what she says will prevail. And, you know, we'll see the usual tensions develop between number 10 and number 11. But obviously business wanted to hear her vision because she's going to be the next Chancellor and she's going to be extremely influential in that Labour government.
Would she not suggest, Jim, that she's calling the shots as far as policy is concerned generally? Because the Conservative Party, every time she suggests a particular initiative, seem to pinch it on her.
Yes, not only the Conservatives pinching virtually everything, but of course yesterday we had a significant announcement on the Kunzberg programme from the current Chancellor that he's committed to the triple lock for pensions. And Laura Kunzberg got out of him not only the triple lock, you know, for 1 year, but for the whole term of the next Parliament. And this is clearly the government's strategy to try and make it difficult for Rachel Reeves. You know, they're trying to constantly find an issue which traps the Labour Party into saying, you've now gone too far and we can't accept that. And then they say, there we are, you see, we're better off under the Tories. Of course, the other way round, Labour have really tried to exploit this indication from Jeremy Hunt that he might abolish national insurance. And they, of course, now call it the £48 billion unfunded hole in the Conservatives' budget. you can see how it's going back and forth. But yeah, I mean, Reeves, go back to your question, in the May's lecture, she was talking about stability. That's what was needed in the economy, without making too many promises. Just saying we will be different from them in the sense that we'll give you stability.
I think that, in fairness to Labour, what they have learned from the past is that they've got to be ever cautious. They have a very hostile right-wing media to deal with. You do have these attacks as soon as a pledge is made. We've seen the relentless narrative around the £28 billion pledge that was made over green investment that was made at a Labour conference 2 or 3 years ago, when the financial circumstances, the economic circumstances in the country were far different, of course. But they pounded Labour, pounded them, continued to say this is an unfunded promise, to the point where Labour have now decided to backtrack on that particular pledge. But you can understand, I think, Jim, why a shadow chancellor would be reluctant to lay out too many promises, given A, the economic situation, B, the fact that every time they announce something that could be seen as an initiative that is positive, it is pinched by the government, and C, as I say, every other thing that they announce is attacked relentlessly by the right-wing press. Why would Rachel Reeves lay out a progressive programme when actually she has all those factors to take account of?
To inspire voters to enthusiastically vote for the Labour Party like they did in 1997.
But did Labour really? Yeah, I mean, I think we can sometimes look back at that period with rose-tinted spectacles, if I may suggest. And I was involved in that campaign. I can't remember Gordon Brown making too many promises. I think the big one that he stuck to was minimum wage. And again, if you look at Labour's programme for workers' rights, then that's quite radical, actually. There's some significant reforms that Rachel Reeves did make reference to in her speech. Angela Rayner has been well trailed over the weekend, saying these are the sort of things that we're going to introduce into the workplace that will improve workers' rights. I can't remember too many other things, Jim, that Labour radically promised during that election. The 5 pledges were, again, they weren't massively progressive at the time. Okay, we'll reduce NHS waiting list, we'll invest a bit more in education. But what Gordon Brown was always insistent upon is we will stick to the Conservative spending plans. And he hammered that home. And there was an awful lot of people on the left of the party at the time who were very, very uncomfortable with that approach, didn't want that to be the narrative, wanted him to go further. He stuck to his guns, and then actually when he took over the chancellorship, went a step further and gave the Bank of England independence. An absolutely incredible step for a Labour chancellor to take. So this idea that in 1997 the Labour Party had enthused everyone with this massively radical programme of economic change of investment, I think, as I say, it is a little bit for the birds. I think the big difference in 97, if we're to be totally honest, is that in Tony Blair and to an extent Gordon Brown, you just have more charismatic characters in charge of the Labour Party at that time. And I would suggest as well, people around them, like Prescott, who was probably the male version of Angela Rayner, if I can put it that way, but a good campaigner. People like Robin Cook, some big, what we call political beasts in that shadow cabinet. I think that had more to do with our feeling now that in 97 Labour had this machine. I haven't even mentioned Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell, rather than an economic programme that they were setting out that was massively different to what the Tories were pursuing at the time.
Yeah, I think they did promise Sure Start as well, which was a major programme. But I think it was.
But then Rachel Reeves has promised breakfast clubs for every kid in the that pledge was made in the May's lecture, and I think that it's no good saying. Again, the Tories were saying at that time to Brown, "Where are you going to get the money? Where are you going to get the cash?" And Brown just said, "Well, we're going to stick within your spending plans, but we're going to change priorities," and that's basically what Rachel Reeves is saying, isn't it?
Yes, what I'm saying is that in the absence of a charismatic leader like Tony Blair, Sir Keir Starmer isn't that. There is pressure. I'm not creating the pressure. I'm just commenting on it. There is pressure on Rachel Reeves to allow a bit more flexibility because with a dull leader, you need exciting policies, and that's the tension. But she is sticking to the strategy where we've got a dull but sure-footed leader, and I'm a cautious chancellor, and she's reckoning that after all the years of Tory turmoil, that will be enough for the electorate. So it's as you brilliantly outlined the situation in 1997, but it's a different dynamic now. And some people are saying that because we don't have a Tony Blair and all the people around him, although I could argue for Wes Streeting and Johnny Reynolds and people like that, but they're Reynolds isn't as well known as Streeting is. That full set isn't really in the public mind. That there is that pressure from people who wish Labour well, and obviously from the left of the party, to actually get her to be more specific. Of course, she's now saying she's combing through the budget to find more money, but it's a game of chess, between one party and the other. But I think the public are looking on at this with either amusement or despair, because it's all very, very political and tactical. And of course, since we last did a podcast, the speculation about an autumn statement is coming up. So Rachel Reeves can have another challenge there. It looks as if in September, Hunt will have one last throw of the dice. And if the regular budget, a couple of weeks ago, was seen as opportunistic and political, just wait for September.
Yes, but I think there's two other things I've mentioned in terms of the comparison to 1997 with people are harking back to. The economic situation that Labour inherited, far, far better than what this Labour government would inherit. And the second point I'd make in terms of 97 is not only did you have those sort of big beasts that we've mentioned in terms of the Labour Party at that time, but I think that it was 18 years Labour had been in opposition. Brown and Blair were not under any pressure from anyone to do anything other than win. They had to win. Now, I'm not quite sure what the difference between 14 and 18 years is, other than 4 years, of course. But it seems an awful long time to be in opposition to me. But it appears that even getting the pasting that they took back in 2019 with St. Jeremy as the leader, people like Owen Jones and co will still not be satisfied until full red-blooded socialism is rammed down the throat of the British electorate, and all those red wall voters will wake up one morning and see the light. Just seems daft to me, Jim, that after, as I say, 14 years in opposition, all of those challenges that we know the Labour Party faces with, as I say, largely a hostile press in this country, a government that inevitably get more press inches than the opposition does. I just can't see how you would expect Rachel Reeves to do anything other than she's doing. And I actually think she deserves a little more credit than she got for some of the things she said during that Mace lecture. One of which, from a private sector perspective, really interesting. She acknowledged that we're not going to have access to masses of public sector cash because, of course, we've spent up as far as that's concerned. But she did say there's plenty of money out there. And what we want to do is access private finance, and we want to sit down with business, outline our plans, and we do want to start to plan for infrastructure improvements, improvements to road, to rail, to connectivity, and to start to improve and increase our productivity at UK PLC, which is crucial if actually the country is going to get back on its feet. And it seemed to me that she was starting to lay the foundations of a plan for recovery there.
Yes, and let's hope that the private sector does come up to the plate, because this is a real opportunity to convince the Owen Jones and people like that capitalism actually works, because there are entrepreneurs, people with large funds prepared to work with the Labour government to actually deal with the big investment issues that we actually need. It's going to be a very, very interesting challenge. I mean, we can already see with the Andy Burnham, Andy Street proposal to try and revive in some form, not the full-blown HS2, but to improve the rail links between Manchester and Birmingham, that they will require large chunks of private sector cash. And in the months that follow an election, the government, the Labour government, would have an industrial strategy. I think they're going to have I'm an old-fashioned guy. I remember a thing called NEDI, which was a way of bringing government and business together and using that as a platform for actually making the investments, and we'll see whether business wants to do it. I mean, business has got its own pressures, but if business fails a Labour government, which does, as you say, lack, the public sector resources to put into these things, then they will pay. They will be rightly criticised. But it will be a fascinating few months to see how the private sector come to the wicket and are prepared to support government projects.
A couple of other things that interested me, Jim. She referenced Margaret Thatcher. That always excites the headline writers of newspapers. And I think, again, an awful lot of people took to social media from the left of the party saying this is an outrage. Margaret Thatcher being referenced by a Labour shadow chancellor. But what she was actually saying, both in terms of her critique of Thatcherism and indeed her critique of New Labour, was that although some of the policies that were undertaken during that time were correct, they didn't manage to tackle the things that she came into politics to tackle, namely, and I'm generalising here, people who are in poverty, taking people out of poverty and making people in work have better conditions and so on and so forth. So a bit of a kick at Thatcherism and the New Labour years as well, I sensed. And then the other thing that she said, I'm not sure there's enough being made of this, was that, yes, we will not go over the budget spend that we have at the moment in terms of the ratio of how much we owe in terms of borrowing. And that will be the same as it is now at the end of the Parliament. And it seemed to me that she gave herself some wiggle room there, Jim, because it means that in years 1, 2, 3, and maybe even 4 of a 5-year Parliament, she can increase spending as long as she gets it back to the level where it is now in year 5. So, as I say, I think that the speech was a little bit more radical than people have given her credit for.
Yes, and some commentators have said that these references to Margaret Thatcher by Starmer and Reeves show that they're a little bit more confident now that they can actually say these things and take the criticism that comes from the left. I mean, I just as a parenthesis to this issue, I'm sure you've listened to and watched a number of programs commemorating the miners' strike of 1984-5. And, whilst we might praise Mrs. Thatcher for a number of things, the way in which the government made no provision for what would happen afterwards in all those areas. I mean, nowadays, whether it's actually delivered or not, we are so much into regeneration and what are we going to put in place of something that happens. And the complete absence of that is one of the big indictments of Margaret Thatcher. I mean, if she'd had a plan and said, look, we're going to close the mines, but we're going to do this and we're going to do that, but there was a complete absence of that. Just one other thing, of course, this Ming Vaz approach, which you support, is working. I mean, you've alluded to the opinion polls continuing with an increasing Labour majority, and we're almost reaching the point now where Reform and the Conservatives are polling about the same.
Yeah, and we'll come on to that in the second part of the programme, but I just return to the view that I think Rachel Reeves is starting to sharpen her elbows a little and say things that people are not necessarily either wanting to pick up or picking up. And, that is a pretty significant shift to say, well, at the end of the Parliament, we won't be borrowing anymore. But as I say, she's not committing to that, sticking to the spending plans in years 1 to 4. she's not talking about the private sector in this country simply investing in the UK. I'm sure she's talking about FDIs and foreign direct investments as well, making the UK a more attractive place for people to invest the cash. And what that means, I think, is setting out longer term plans in terms of infrastructure projects. Now, hey, we saw what happened with HS2. Are we going to be able to convince the international finance community that the UK is serious about those longer term investments? I think the disappointment I have with Labour at this moment in time, understandable though this is, no mention of the negative impact of Brexit. Nothing about how we can do a much more pragmatic and beneficial trade deal with our European partners. They are totally frit of that particular debate, Jim. Again, understandable given what happened 4 or 5 years ago. My view, however, people have moved on. And I think that if you had a leadership that was a bit more confident in itself, they would be making that case by now.
And not entirely fair. I have heard references to that they want to do better deals over food, over getting artists going backwards and forwards.
But he's ruled out rejoining the customs union. I mean, that's an
international recognition of professional qualifications.
Yeah,
they've said they want to do that.
Yeah, I understand. Again, you mentioned the Ming-Var strategy, and it's almost like that in terms of renegotiation with Europe, I suppose. But I do sense that they could be bold and say, we're going to rejoin the customs union. We're going to basically take Theresa May's deal and implement that. You wouldn't use that phrase, but that's basically a Brexit deal that, although wouldn't have given us the sort of benefits that we had whilst we were a full member of the European Union, would have been the least damaging. And at some point, our politicians are going to have to be honest with us over that. We can't continue to have these trade barriers with our closest trading bloc and expect our economy to recover in the way they're promising.
Yeah, let's remember there's a 4% drag on GDP precisely attributable to Brexit. That's true. Now, nobody is keener than me on us rejoining the European institutions and eventually full membership or associate membership. But I just do think, Frank, that it would be just what the Tories would want. They would grip onto that. Here we go. The deniers. Starmer tried to thwart the decision of the people and all the antics in Parliament up until the 2019 election when Boris spoke for the people. There they go again. And it might just be the issue that really ignites anxieties amongst some people. I think the better strategy, you can call it deception if you want, but is for them to get into office, start doing this collaboration with international finance and the private sector here on infrastructure, and then say, you know what, we need to start doing that, and then in the middle of the Parliament, say we are the government now. We've been in office for a year or two. We are making an assessment. This is an intolerable drag on our economy, 4% on GDP. We are going to seek to re-enter the single market or whatever is appropriate. I don't know what you think about that. I just think it would just be too dangerous now. The Tories are so desperate for something, they really would go for that.
Yeah, I think you're right in the attacks that will come on the back of any sort of statement that Labour made regarding the customs union. By the way, it's not just the Labour Party that stopped talking about Europe. It's the Liberal Democrats who based their whole campaign, the last election, on rejoining the European Union, or a second referendum it may have been. I can't remember which. Who was the leader? She lost her seat.
Jo Swinson.
Yeah, go back and prepare for government, I think was the last phrase.
Well, I come before you as a prime minister. Yeah, and I think the Lib Dems are in great danger. I mean, they're fighting and deliberately so. They're not fighting. I don't think they'll fight a sort of national campaign in the full sense of the word. They will fight hard around London in the southwest to try and regain some seats. So in a sense, it's a minimalist strategy. They obviously suffer from the problem that they're not the third party. I mean, the Scottish Nationalists are the third party. That's been terribly important in terms of being called at Prime Minister's questions, appearing on political programmes. And Sir Ed Davey, we've talked about it, another uncharismatic leader. And what they need is a bit of excitement. And they possibly could, but it's too late now probably, they could have risked a pro-European strategy, a bold strategy, saying, look, there is that, the other two parties are fit. We are the party of Europe. It would give, though, and there is a substantial number of people who do regard our membership of the European Union as extremely important. They would attract those supporters. There's some evidence that one of the reasons for the abysmal ratings of the Lib Dems is because people sort of think, well, Labour's going to be the government, and we think that eventually that's the vehicle back. And they've drifted from the Lib Dems to Labour.
Yeah. So an awful lot of our politicians at the moment not particularly prepared to be open and honest about how we get ourselves out of the turmoil that we're in. And yes, we've just given them a pay increase. So Jim and I will be talking about whether £91,000 a year is an outrageous amount of money to be paying a member of Parliament, or indeed whether that's a fair salary, as the independent commission that decides MPs' pay believe, or indeed whether they should be getting paid a bit more. We'll also be looking at those polls that Jim referenced briefly as well. Stick with us. We'll be back in a moment. Hi, my name's Frank McKenna, and I'm here to tell you about Downtown and Business's Changemakers Live conference, which takes place at Liverpool's Spine Building in the city's Knowledge Quarter on Thursday, the 18th of April. We've got some fantastic speakers, including the head honcho of capital-centric Tim Heatley, the disruptor developer. We've got Rose Marley coming along to join us. She is the Chief Executive of Cooperatives UK. And we've got Joe Phillips, who is the former advisor to Paddy Ashdown and Bob Geldof. Quite a coupling there. Anyway, come along and see some fantastic speakers, not just those three, some other excellent contributors to Changemakers Live 2024. That's on the 18th of April, Liverpool. Book your tickets now on the link below. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, the Chief Executive and Group Chairman of Downtown and Business, and our political commentator, Jim Hancock. The first part of the programme, we've talked about Rachel Reeves, constraining her spending, being very pragmatic in her approach. But this week, outrageously, we were told that MPs were going to be given a 5%, whopping 5% pay increase, taking their salary from £86,000 a year to £91,000 a year. James, are you as outraged as Mr. and Mrs. Joe and Joanne blogs appear to be from my social media feed?
No, I'm not. I've always taken a rather unfashionable view about a number of things in this area, starting with local government. I always felt that the coverage when councillors had a bit of a banquet to honour somebody, the press went berserk. Councillors' expenses, they went berserk, and didn't pay any attention to either the huge budget that they were talking about, of which these things were a tiny part, or to the more serious scandals that sometimes councils got involved with in procurement contracts and things like that. They're easy hits to say our politicians, our councillors are paid too much. But concentrating on MPs, two things we have to remember. There was a big suppression of MPs' salaries in the 1980s and 90s, and we all know where that ended, where they were given a nod and a wink. We can't increase your salary because the public will go berserk. So have generous expenses. And so we had all the stuff about duck houses and flipping of residences and the huge scandal that came up during Gordon Brown's prime ministership. And the other thing, Frank, is in these times where our public servants are being subjected to unconscionable abuse on social media, I know 100 Tory MPs are leaving Parliament, and a lot of that will be because they've given up and because of the political cycle. But there are quite a number who have just had enough of it. And as I've said before on these blogs, and I think you've agreed with me, we don't know what good people who might have a tiny skeleton in their cupboard are saying, you know what, I'm not going to touch it with a barge pole. So when we complain about the political leaders we've got aren't up to the old days and things, these things are all related. And 91 grand, you know, it's a pretty full-time commitment. I mean, obviously Parliament goes into recess for large chunks of the year, but I mean, they're having to work in their constituencies, and their constituency workers now, they're doing a lot of the work the councillors should be doing, quite frankly. So I know people will think, oh, he's just mates with MPs, but that's honestly what I think.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, actually. I was being a little facetious in my opening remarks. I've always argued that our politicians, both at a local and national level, are not remunerated to the amount that they ought to be. And I say this, of course, with a lot of experience, not just as a local authority leader, but also as somebody who worked in Parliament for 7 years as a parliamentary assistant. And I have to tell you that it was that period which really did start to put a big question mark for me personally over whether that was the sort of lifestyle I wanted to pursue. And I think what people underestimate is the huge impact and sacrifice that MPs need to make when they decide to do that job in terms of their work-life balance, because quite frankly, there isn't one. And you made the point there, which always seems to avoid people's attention. And that is that a parliamentary recess does not mean an MP is on holiday. Not like teachers' holidays, where they're 6 weeks in the summer and they can disappear and they come back in September and they start the lessons again. An MP, as you rightly say, Jim, has to go back into the constituency, and most of that parliamentary recess is spent with them dealing with casework, holding advice surgeries, opening garden fetes, going to youth clubs, knocking on doors. That's the life of an MP. And if you are, in particular, a member of Parliament representing a Northern or Scottish constituency, then your life is an absolute misery. Let me just give you a flavour of what that means for an individual who represents a constituency such as that. It means that on a Sunday, you are going to have to get yourself on a train and hope that it's on time to get you into Euston at a reasonable hour. You go to bed, maybe in a nice flat, but maybe in not such salubrious surroundings, and you then start work in Parliament on Monday afternoon, and you will have some votes that you may have to attend, some debates. You will want to ask some parliamentary questions. You will have been inundated over the weekend with requests from your constituents about a whole range of matters. You'll be trying to catch the attention of a government minister or junior minister to take up those issues with them. Tuesday and Wednesday, more of the same. Prime Minister's questions, you're going to try and get in the chamber, and you're going to try and get yourself on the telly or on the radio or in your local newspaper by asking a question at PMQs. Highly unlikely, but that's what you will attempt to do. Thursday, you will then hope that there is not a 3-line whip to mean that you can get on a train back to your constituency early, so that Friday you can have the day off. No, you can go into your constituency office, meet with your staff, find out the issues locally that have been going on the 4 days that you've been in London, and then Saturday morning you're likely to have an advice surgery again. Saturday afternoon, you're lucky you'll get to spend with your family. Saturday night, you're probably going to be at a function of a local charity, a local voluntary organisation, or your Labour Party or Conservative Party to do a fundraising event. Sunday morning breakfast with the family, Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, back on the train, back to London, it all starts again. Now, if you're telling me that that is a job that sounds to you that £91,000 a year is overly paid, then I'm saying to you, you are fucking nuts, because it is a job that I wouldn't do. And add to that the point that Jim has just made, that you are subjected these days, and this wasn't the case back in the sort of 90s and early 2000s when I was involved, to a whole range of online abuse, a scrutiny of your private life that is beyond the pale. And unless you're Boris Johnson, does seem to impact on you, both in terms of politically and personally, certainly impacts on your family. And to me, Jim, we should be looking at getting MPs' salaries up to at least £150,000 a year. And then the other thing that I think is absolutely essential these days, because of the way in which we communicate now, we need to start to actually staff officers of those MPs properly as well. Because the issue that you have in 2024 that you didn't have back in 1997, 2002, 2003, when I was doing the job, you didn't have email. You at least didn't have everybody on email. And so we would typically get about 50 letters a week, Jim, in terms of enquiries. Most people, if they wanted to see their MP, would book an appointment at the surgery, come in and sort of have a one-to-one with you. And so your casework was relatively manageable. These days, I've heard MPs saying they get over 3,000 email inquiries a week. Now, with the staffing levels that we had back in 97, which I understand are the same now, how are you supposed to cope with that sort of magnitude of work? So for all those reasons, Jim, I'm saying we need to look at a way of really hiking the salaries and the expenditure for our parliamentarians, or accept you get what you pay for.
Well, you called me Goldilocks at the beginning of this podcast, so I'm now going to do this middle of the road, not too hot, not too cold. Just to slightly put some counter arguments into that. You know, we've broadly established in this conversation that we're on the same page. In terms of the parliamentary week, I just make the observation. I'm not saying that MPs aren't doing things, but I do make the observation that the parliamentary week is heavily squeezed into Tuesdays and Wednesdays. You see all the select committees and the standing committees tend to meet on those days, and Mondays is pretty thin, and so is Thursdays, and Fridays always was a thin day. So I think, you know, MPs are, and of course the other thing is they do not sit all night like they used to. There are these cut-off points, and there's deferred voting, which I don't agree with, where they have a debate and then they have a deferred vote on a Tuesday or a Wednesday when they're all there. So they have slightly softened that routine that you suggested, although I'm sure that while they're staying in the constituencies, they're probably having to do other work as well. But just moving on, I mean, I think this 5% is
Can I just, before we do move on, Jim, because it's an important point that you raise, and I accept that point, and obviously I was sort of overlaying the issues that a member of parliament faces. But equally, don't you think that now that we have had these technological advances, now that we do expect certain things within the workplace to just be a natural right or a responsibility of our employer, employee, and so on, don't you think that it's time to radically review the way in which Parliament works? Do we really need people these days to be queuing up to vote when you can simply have these things and all the security that you can have in terms of online voting, for example? Do we really need to be so obsessed with these antiquated traditions that we have in Parliament? And for you and I, listen, we love that sort of pomp and ceremony. I do. You know, I absolutely love Parliament and that tradition that you sense as soon as you go into the place. There is a magic about the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But I do think that if you're looking at a 21st century democracy, people coming into that place must nod their heads in bewilderment at times.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I mean, I'm a great traditionalist as well, and I would want to look at each reform in its turn. But I do think the radical change that could be made is in this voting thing. I mean, last week, for instance, when the government reversed 7 amendments by the House of Lords on the Rwanda bill, it was 2 hours of going through the lobbies to vote, and all the votes were more or less the same because it was the government versus the opposition, and it takes up a huge amount of time. And I do think we could move to electronic voting. The argument against it is it's a chance for backbench MPs to brush shoulders with ministers as they shuffle through, and it's a contact point. But I think there are other ways of doing it, and I think things could be proceeded with far better. I do agree with you about that sort of thing. It's
Sorry, James, I cut you off there. You're going to say the 5% increase.
Well, I thought. I mean, it's
got
sort
your
of
Goldilocks hat on. So
well, it's. I mean, I'm saying it's comparable with what the settlements that have been reached with the public sector workers, apart from the doctors who are still deluding themselves they can get 35% out. But I mean, you made another interesting point about the needing. I think 150,000 is just a bit eye-watering at the moment. But I do agree with staffing up, and that goes to, of course, the redesign of the whole Palace of Westminster, which of course is something that's got to come up soon. Last week, those of us who got access to the House of Commons were sent a consultation because another proposal's come out, either for a full decant of the parliamentary estate, an attempt to try and do it while keeping Parliament going within there, or just carrying on with the current thing where you do bits and pieces of repairs. But if they are going to do a full
decant,
just
explain to listeners who are not Parliament. I mean, it's a tired building. There's all sorts of things going wrong. There's some fairly serious health and safety challenges as well. And but again, we come back to this challenge, don't we? Bloody spending all this money on Parliament when we've got no money to spend on potholes.
Yeah. Well, yes, there's asbestos in the building. There's literally a Victorian sewage system, electrical wires and water mains run side by side, and bits of masonry are regularly falling off. So they've got to take a decision about that. But I'm just saying that when the new whatever it's going to be, I mean, there is an argument that you should make the Palace of Westminster a museum of democracy and build an entirely new headquarters for our Parliament. But whatever, I think you make a very good point that the office accommodation for MPs should be to meet the 21st century. At the moment, we've got this, some MPs are in a building called Norman Shaw North and Portcullis House, and they have quite reasonable offices, but a lot of them are still in little cubby holes in the Palace of Westminster itself. It's all very romantic, but if you're going to staff up in order to cope with 3,000 emails a week or whatever you said it was, then you're going to have to think about better accommodation for MPs. But you're absolutely right. There will be a howl of protest, they're building a gilded palace for themselves and so on. But I think people have got to be mature about it, and if they want a functioning democracy, they've got to pay for it.
Yeah, we were in one of those cubby holes, I have to tell you, and it was quaint, and it wasn't something at the time that you felt that you were in some way being, you didn't feel as though you were being put upon, if I can use that phrase. But when I look back now and reflect, you weren't able to do any proper work from that office.
No, but they were highly praised. They were highly sought after to be in the Palace of Westminster.
Well, you wanted to
so
be
you didn't
there.
have to go through the underground, so you get to the division.
Yeah, absolutely. You wanted to be in there. I remember when we were given that office. I think we were quite fortuitous because we got it in 92 or 93. And so fairly early on in terms of when I was parliamentary assistant down there to the West Lancashire MP. And, we did feel as though it was we were in a privileged place. But when you reflect now, you think, well, I never did any work when I was in the Palace of Westminster, because the only thing that you were able to do really was glad hand people, make yourself known to others, try and make the case for some constituency campaigns that you were involved in. And the first 2 years, I think I spent most of my time down there trying to convince a number of MPs to support our plans for a boundary change, which would make West Lancashire a safe Labour seat, which I actually managed to do. So as far as my boss was concerned, it was time well spent. But you literally didn't have anywhere to go and decant and sit down at a desk and do some work. It was nuts. I think it has improved a bit now. As you say, they've got those new offices across the way there. But there is a need for a radical reform, I think, in the way in which we look at how we deal with our parliamentarians. I think there's a need to reform the House of Lords, how to save money and put that money into elected politicians, well, maybe we should be scaling back the Lords significantly rather than every time we have an opportunity, we throw a load of people in there to, I don't know, what does it reward them for? Usually fucking services to the Conservative Party and donations, it seems to me. So I think we can, without necessarily spending masses more money, Jim, through a reform programme, but also giving MPs what they deserve, make our parliamentary democracy a bit more qualitative than it is at the moment. And this is the final point I'll make, if I may, and be happy for you to come back on this and finish this part of the conversation. If we don't start to pay people what they deserve, then you will continue to see, and I hate to say this because it's not every MP at this moment in time is worse than the last lot. And we do, as I said earlier, look back sometimes with rose-tinted spectacles. But you are seeing more and more people who I talk to, try to persuade to go into politics, both at local and national level, saying to me, you must, I thought you're, I actually said to somebody last week who asked me that question, I thought you were a mate. Why would I want to go back into elected politics, given the situation that you're in? Now, money is only part of this, and again, I accept that. But unless and until we start to appreciate the huge pressures and the very good job that most of our parliamentarians do, then I sense that we are going to really struggle to attract the sort of people into Parliament that we'd like to see there.
Yep, no, I completely agree with you. We can move on. We ought to do something in one podcast about the boundary changes that are going to be coming into force at the next general election, and see whether your successors have done an equally good job on the boundaries, because they are quite extensive.
Yeah. Well, that West Lancashire seat was a marginal, and it's been safe since '97, and it was my legacy, James, to the local Labour Party was that. Even in 2019, we won it comfortably. So that Labour won it comfortably, I should say. So there you go. Right, let's turn to the polls then. And we did to death the Conservative Party's trials and tribulations last week. So I'm not going to spend too much time on reviewing the polls. I just thought it was interesting that in one poll at the weekend, the Tories were down at 18%, which is a record low for them. It's lower than when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. And a comparison was made, Jim, you may know more about this than I do, to be fair, that over in Canada, the Conservative Party there was as successful, almost a electoral winning machine, as the UK Tory Party. And in one election, not too long ago, they ended up with 3 seats. In fact, they ended up with 2 seats. The polls were predicting they'd get 3 seats. They ended up with 2 seats. Their leader lost her seat. They were absolutely decimated. And of course, if these polls were translated into results, then a similar tsunami of losses would be suffered by the government and the Conservatives. I can't see that happening. But you referenced this very briefly earlier. The rise of reform seems to be giving the Conservative Party a real problem, Chip.
Yes, well, and the polls are now getting very interesting. I mean, polls are polls, and we always have to put that caveat in. But the fact that the Conservative rating and the Reform rating are almost reaching the same in one or two polls, when what the Reform's on about 14%, the Conservatives on 18%. I mean, that's pretty incredible. I mean, some commentator I was listening to at the weekend was saying, could it be that we are going to see at this election the formation of a situation where the right is split between Reform and the Conservative Party, thus leaving Labour generally in office for the next 10, 20 years, in exactly the same way as the SDP split the left in the 1980s to the benefit of Margaret Thatcher. So that is that has to be a possibility. I mean, what seems to be the case is that we've been discussing earlier what the Shadow Chancellor and the Chancellor have been doing, but it does seem as if people have turned off. That they've made their decision unusually in advance. I mean, there's generally a view that people don't really fully concentrate on their choice until an actual election campaign's called, and that may still be the case. But it does seem as if people have said, it is time for a change. I've had enough. I don't feel much better off. I mean, we can go back and forth about inflation coming down, but the two things about that. One is the effect of that takes time to feed through, and in some key areas like petrol and mortgages, it's still going up 5, 6, I think it's 9% in one. Car insurance, you tried to reinsure your car recently, all those sort of things, and people have said, look, I'm not feeling better off. I'm not particularly convinced by Labour, but I'm going to give them a change. And then I think that's why we're seeing the polls. And the other thing, Frank, I think is there's beginning to be an irritation that we're now going to be waiting until the autumn. There's even some conservatives who are sort of what they call them rip off the plaster. Let's get on with it. Let's get into opposition and let's rebuild. So I think that is a gamble. And he's ruled out May the 2nd. If they're really bad elections, the pressure to at least go to the country earlier and limit the damage, because there is a school of thought which says that if he goes on October, November, people will be really angry and the defeat could be even worse.
I'm hearing October the 10th, but we will see. Very, very strong.
My birthday, Frank. My birthday.
Oh, well, there you go, Jim. That would be like the best birthday present for you, wouldn't it? You're such a sad bastard.
I will still be available for podcast
election on my bed. That would be like all of Jim's dreams come at once. Honestly, it would be absolutely tremendous for Jim. Well, let's hope then, Jim. 10th of October is what I've been. That's the latest rumour. Listen, I was told a few weeks ago it was definitely.
But that would mean that would mean the cancellation of the party conferences. We've discussed this before. There's such money earners for the parties. We have talked about. Doesn't Sunak, want to hold his party conference and make the money there and perhaps launch the general election at the end of the party conference? I don't know.
I don't buy that in a sense. I know I've put those points forward, but equally, they've had this huge donation, haven't they, from the guy who made the racist remarks. They're not going to give that money back. There's only so much money you can spend. Tory party conference this year, I think it'd be as big a car crash as last year's. That's the danger he's got. Does he really want to see a conference take place where Farage has got bigger queues of people going to see him, Liz Truss at the other end of the prom, and Rishi trying to come up with what's he going to cancel this year? Christmas.
Well, yes,
what's he got to say? I mean, I do think, and I don't say this with any pleasure, by the way, because the cities, of course, that we operate in, I think the Tory party conference this year, if I'm right, is in Birmingham.
Yes.
And of course, in Liverpool, the Labour policy conference is a huge bonanza for hotels, for the hospitality sector. More and more suits come in, of course, to Labour conferences these days because they are expected to be the next government. So it would cost Liverpool a fortune if the conference is cancelled. But increasingly, I'm starting to look at this and thinking, if I was Sunak, would I want to risk a party conference that could really very publicly demonstrate all those splits? And whereas you and I follow this on a daily basis and well aware of all the shenanigans taking place and the 5 or 6 families, whatever it is now, within the Conservative Party, most people probably not aware. But if you had a high-profile party conference where Farage and Truss were the stars of the show again, Jim, is that something Sunak will want to risk?
I just wonder whether even Liz Truss would be brought into line or would bring herself into line under the extreme pressure.
Farage wouldn't be there, would he? He's nothing to stop Farage because he's simply a broadcaster.
Because that's right, he'll go there with a press credential. Yeah. So it would be a platform for he might announce his leadership of reform at the Tory conference.
And what about Johnson?
No, but I think that's where discipline. I mean, there's
you can't discipline Boris Johnson.
No, I wasn't saying that. In fact,
to discipline him, has he?
I saw a story
what appeal are you going to make to Boris Johnson?
Well, I'd heard there was a story that Sunak had a friendly conversation with him and that Boris was going to work the north of England for them. So,
well, I can show you at least a dozen conversations that Boris Johnson has had over the past 20 years where people have come away thinking, oh, it's all great. He's going to back me. He's going to support me. He's going to do this. And guess what? Boris doesn't deliver. So I think that even if friendly conversations have been had with 10 Downing Street, a Conservative Party conference in October where Boris Johnson is given the opportunity of a platform as a fringe event to come and tell them how it all should be better with him. Could he resist that? I don't think he could. I really don't think he could. So, listen, 10th of October, as I say, is the date that I'm being given at the moment, but a catastrophic set of election results on the 2nd of May may bring that election day forward. The thing that you were very, very firm about last week, Jim, was that you didn't see any potential of Sunak being removed before the general election. And the comfort within these polls, little though it is, that Rishi Sunak can take, is that if you put almost any other name next to the Conservative Party leadership, then actually the support for the Tory party goes down rather than up. It was around the same when Penny Mordaunt was named as the alternative leader, but Badenoch, Braverman, Gove, so on and so they all see a dip in support for the Conservatives if any of those people took over the leadership. And I guess that's as much to do with the fact that how mad would you be to give up, say, third Prime Minister in 3 years? I think the public, as you were suggesting this last week, to be fair to you, would simply say then that this lot have gone mad.
Yes, well, unelected prime minister.
Yeah.
That's the key point about that.
Yeah.
So I think these alternatives, there isn't you can argue that Johnson is outside the party and Farage. These are the sort of stars that you need inside the Conservative tent to make a further change of leader credible, but they're not available. They're not in the Conservative Party.
I don't think, actually, Jim, I think, not Farage, obviously, but I don't think Johnson polls particularly well. I think
he brings huge baggage as well,
Yeah, I think this is a myth which the Tory party continue to convince themselves of. As I mentioned last week, they have this bizarre notions of Tories of looking back. If they could, they'd dig Margaret Thatcher up and think she was going to be able to do a good job for them on the basis that, somehow in 1990, people really did conspire to do it in and get rid of her. Well, the biggest conspirator and person that brought Margaret Thatcher's downfall was Margaret Thatcher. And in exactly the same way as it was with Boris Johnson. But of course, the party troops love Thatcher. And the foot soldiers in 2024 still love Boris Johnson. But the people out there don't.
But that's always the dynamic in politics, isn't it? There's a yearning after Jeremy Corbyn, unelectable. There's a yearning after Margaret Thatcher in 1990, unelectable, actually, by the general public.
Yeah, absolutely. So the polls, as I say, mixed bag of results there for Sunak. I think what the Tories will be most concerned about is that creeping rise of the reform support. And if Farage did decide that he was going to come back as leader of that party, then again, these particular polls suggest that they will get a further spike of between 2 and 3%. And the vast majority of that support comes from the Conservative Party, of course, which is why it's such a big concern to them. The other concern to Tories, Jim, is that both Farage and its current leader, Richard Tice, Reform leader, have said there will absolutely be no deal this time with the Tory party. And they will remain firm on that, I think, because their ambition, I sense, in this election is to see a realignment of the right rather than be too concerned as to whether there is a Labour government or not. So that's my sense of it. I don't know what you think.
Yes, no, I think just as we've seen in the United States, and we don't know whether these things are permanent or not, but it appears that even without Donald Trump, the Republican Party in the United States wants to be a different party from the one that we've been used to associated with George Bush and Ronald Reagan and people like that. that it wants to be a radical right party. And, it's now a question of whether the Conservative Party wants to be that as well. And, I think that's I think is probably what reform strategy is. I mean, I'm glad you've said you do not think reform will renege on that pledge, because, of course, spectacularly, Farage did pull his candidates, UKIP candidates, in 2019 to the huge benefit of Boris Johnson. So one's always a bit weary of that. But Tice has been so emphatic that a repudiation of that now he would just immediately earn, oh, you're no different from all the others. And he wants to sort of say, I'm an honest politician, like Lee Anderson says, I speak it as I see it. But if they did a deal at the last minute, they would lose that sort of credibility.
Yeah, what would their rationale be as well? Because it was all to do with Brexit in 2019 and the spectre of Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. And, the fact that, Brexit's done. And as we discussed in the first part of the programme, nobody's suggesting that be reversed in any way. And you can't exactly hold Keir Starmer up as some sort of radical lunatic who's going to take the country towards republicanism. So I think that, reform will fight as many seats as it possibly can. And that in itself would suggest that Labour are going to win. I think the question now is, the two questions is about when and how many by. So we will wait and see, James. So we've got an Easter recess coming up. We do want to continue to allow you to listen to our dulcet tones next week. So Jim and I are going to have a conversation as to what that might look like. But I know he's going away. I've got all sorts of things happening, not least starting to chew my nails again about my wonderful football club, Everton. Let's see if there's another points deduction on the way. Certain games that we've got to win, Bournemouth away being the first one on Saturday. So hopefully we will be back with you next week with another episode of the Downtown End Politics podcast. In the meantime, have a fantastic Easter. Don't eat too many eggs, and we'll see you after the break. Cheers.